Welcome back. I want to get back to you, Jarred, on this measurement discussion that we had before the break. Surely, Jarred, with the number of clients who work, I mean, let's just talk the big clients. Surely you work with, in partnership with many of the other agencies. You must have a bit of a handle on what percentage of their budget is going towards digital. And one can then extrapolate from that exactly the size of the market. So I'm thinking you guys are not really serious about getting a number, or there's a reason to underplay the number.
Well, I mean that's confidential information. So I mean,
I don't want to know who's. I don't want to know
Sure.
who's spending how much. Sure. But you can take out the names and you can add up the numbers, and you can use my arithmetic to get at some
Thebe,
percentage.
I think the answer is you're right. Most people do have a sense of what the numbers are, and that's what I was kind of going back to earlier. Is I don't think ADEX and these kind of traditional ways of measuring are being used as the way to determine it. I think that there is a general understanding in the industry and among clients of where the numbers sit, and they are 15 to 20% kind of spend numbers. That is kind of where they're settling for the time being, and they're growing rapidly. So I think that's the point. And that's why the IIB is not utilizing direct submissions from publishers as our data source.
Yeah, because I mean that's why people say that digital is growing. They must have based it on something.
Absolutely.
They couldn't just have based it on 2% and say it's growing, because that 2% is nothing. We know that.
Absolutely, yeah. That 2% should be disregarded in its entirety. Yeah. It's a meaningless number.
Mark, I'd just like to pick up on a point you raised earlier on about definitions, what constitutes digital. Is there not a need to take a step even further back and say, part of the problem is we've been measuring audiences on digital, which we've been doing on conventional media for the last 40 years, when in actual fact, most of the dynamic has shifted to engagement. So the challenge then is, how do we measure audiences and how do we measure engagement, and what's the difference? Which one is digital, which one is activation? Where does it begin, where does it end?
Certainly, I think if we were to take an example of any one of the larger digital economies, so you could take the Ivory Coast, you could take Nigeria, you could take Kenya, you could take South Africa. Pick the top 3 banks, let's say, on social media, right? Now, let's just say that they're all north of 100,000 people who, if we take Facebook, for instance, who've liked them. Not that many people can tell you of that particular audience how many are converting, or not that many compete on how many are sustained in engagement and in some of the brand's initiatives. So as you're saying, sometimes it's vanity metrics to pursue audience in terms of some of the hard and fast numbers. And as some of our studies have shown at Nendo, we've seen a number of people gaming the system in order to essentially falsely acquire some of those numbers to basically resolve their clients' desires to push for numbers relative to competitors, as opposed to competing, as you've rightly put it, on engagement and more specifically on conversion. Right? We're seeing a broad shift, I'd imagine, and I'm sure Jarred could speak to this, because we don't necessarily have an IAB here, certainly not in the formal sense as far as the Global Advertising Bureau goes, but there's certainly the same token that's coming from a number of the industry players here. But we also look in many ways to watch how South Africa plays it. Not too long ago, as far as a few years ago, we looked at it as South Africa as a crystal ball that some lessons could be drawn from. And now in many ways, the growth is tangential, such that Kenya doesn't necessarily follow. And a number of countries outside of Africa aren't X number of years behind South Africa. In many ways, they're carving their own niches and their own approaches towards not just digital as a channel, but also things such as e-commerce and so on.
If I could just pose you another question then, that the mere fact that we're sitting here talking about measuring audiences is a measure of the degree to which we're trapped in doing things the old way. I mean, the real metric for measurement in digital is in-market response, return on media investment. Are we just having the wrong kind of debate? Should we be just talking ROI and leave it at that?
Well, I'll put it to you this way. What do you do if you're in a situation where, like in Zimbabwe, for instance, you have, according to a study that came out that was published by a partner to Econet in 2014, they saw just shy of 25% of all internet traffic on that telco as specifically on WhatsApp. So to Jarred's point about chat and instant messages, which is a kind of a dark side of the web we don't have a lot of insight into, what happens when whole websites and large publishers skip comment sections and instead have their readers organized by WhatsApp groups, and we're certainly seeing the same thing here in Kenya. So you have a completely new and disruptive way that both publishers and audiences have migrated, and so we've got to look at them in many respects as nomadic. And I think I stand with Jarred in terms of just saying that not all of the methodologies that have been used historically to measure, particularly in developed countries in the West, can apply here. And so perhaps it's actually time to see a collaborative effort to see us challenge and follow the nomadic African connected consumer, which is something that our business does, but there's certainly a number of them all across the continent trying to predict trends and predict the future of where they go to next.
Well, I rather like that idea of thinking within an African context, because a lot of times, what really, I guess, held back Africa's development is trying to pigeonhole Africa into how the rest of the world does things. Jarred, which industries, for few of mentioning names of companies, certainly which industries would you say, whether it's here or around the continent that you're familiar with, in our continent, are really doing this right or using the channel or the medium better than anybody else?
Well, I think that in terms of, if you look at media spend, the big spenders online have typically been in financial services. That's really where, I'm sure Gordon would support that, that's really where a lot of the money has come from up until now. And that we do see in most markets as they go online. Financial services tends to lead the charge. But we are seeing it diversify. You're seeing a lot of FMCG companies getting online in a big way. You're seeing a lot of, obviously, travel, a lot of retail starting, automotive. So I think that a lot of industries are very vibrant, and I think a lot of them are starting to use it in a more sophisticated way. I guess that's sort of your corporate industries. I mean, of course, what really leads is gaming. So, they've been doing brilliant stuff for longer than anybody, but it's it's not that easy to learn that many lessons from the way that the gaming industries operate. But I think in South Africa we're starting to see very sophisticated usage of the internet and internet advertising to rival what you see in developed countries, and I think the rest of the continent you'll see bringing up the rear quite fast. I do think it's important to focus on African innovation and to think about what we should be doing differently, to talk to cultures and people that are not in the same frame of mind as you find in Europe and the US. I don't think we do that enough. South Africans are particularly guilty of believing that we're not actually in Africa. And I think that, that is, in my opinion, that's one of the reasons why we're starting to fall behind within the African context, because we're determined to apply models that actually are not that relevant to the continent. I think that's where the Kenyans have an advantage.
Mark, you in East Africa, East Africa is renowned, particularly Kenya, if one has to be more direct, has positioned itself as the digital hub of Africa. What will you say in Kenya, where you really leaps and bounds ahead of everybody else, are some of the industries where you are really showing the power of digital communication or digital marketing? Sure.
I think that for Kenya right now, this is a really testing time for the finance industry in general and the banking industry specifically. Now, the central bank, as viewers of CNBC will probably be aware of by now, set a cap on the interest rates. And with that, we've seen banks have to look elsewhere for ways to compete and deliver what's in essence the same kind of bouquet of goods and services. So the ones who've invested in innovation and certainly in understanding their consumers' patterns, habits, and really their desires are the ones who will win now. And maybe one area that didn't have anything to do with banking, but that now is probably in focus, is the lending space. So what you have is, of course, you have mobile money, and the largest player here, and arguably one of the most respected in the world, M-Pesa, by Safaricom, the largest telco. And on the other hand, you have banks, right? And M-Pesa, as good as it has been as a mobile wallet, has never been that great as far as saving and or lending. And so even though there is a solution in the market, the innovation in that sector has come from a pair, if not a number, of both local and Silicon Valley-based companies that are competing for the Kenyan consumer's wallet, and more importantly, for their mobile device. And what they're doing is they're incorporating digital, meaning social media, from somebody's online footprint to the presence they have on Facebook to what time they call people in a given day. They're taking all the permissions available from a basic smartphone, and they're basically scoring people, credit scoring in a sense, and being able to lend what we're seeing is up to $500 within minutes. And this here, not by the banks, but by a number of companies tangential to them, should see us watch this space.
So surely this one particular access to data must be a problem for marketers, because you may have the greatest ideas, you may have the greatest spend on media, but if people cannot access your message, then it's really just a waste of money, isn't it, Jarred? And then I'd like to hear from Mark as well, after you, Jarred, as to how you're approaching this and how you're helping the consumer to access this, particularly the young consumer who are said to be 70% of the continent under the age of 30, and they are purely on digital.
Look, it's a massive problem that hasn't really been solved. You know, we still are among the most expensive internet connectivity markets in the world, despite everything. It's a massively monopolized, there's a lot of greed in the system. So I think for me the thing that gives me hope about this is we know that telephony is dying, in the sense that the massive margins that cellular companies used to make and have made to build themselves up are starting to be eroded. The next big opportunity for them is data services. You're seeing in the US AT&T buying Time Warner, or trying to buy Time Warner over the weekend. What is that about? It's the realization that telephony and communications, the pipes are not actually where the money is. It's a content layer. So I think that as the consumer's desire for content starts to become congruent with the telecommunications companies' desire to make money, you're going to start to finally see a real democratizing of access. I do think it's going to happen. It's taken ridiculously too long, and I think I think every player in this market should be ashamed of themselves for holding back economic development and social development as a result of, frankly, greed. That's my view.
That's a bit different in Kenya, isn't it, Mark? Because I mean, everybody pretty much does everything on the mobile.
For Kenya, maybe what I could add to the debate, I would probably highlight and say it a bit differently, in that here what we're seeing is you have a number of people pursuing the customer relationship and using price as a way to get in. So you're looking and seeing a market where you obviously have a great amount of competition. But maybe if I could add, I think I empathize very slightly. Nobody likes to take the side of the telco, but certainly those, like in South Africa, who had to commit a significant amount of investment into what's now becoming outdated technology, copper and so on. The leapfrog effect does mean, in the face of good competition, because the continent is, the more you look and the more countries you bring in, still is quite pricey data, you have a situation where they can afford, economically to take the opportunity to onboard more customers. And they're not the only ones. When Facebook comes to town, sits with a telco like Airtel and says they want to open up 18 plus different African markets and give free Facebook through their program, Free Basics, there's an agenda there. Let's make no mistake about that. But they're saying, we'll pay for it. We will go in with you and make sure that they get onto your network. And so we have issues of net neutrality and so on, that even though they're playing out quite strongly in places like India, where Facebook had the ruling go against them, in Africa, I can probably say it's 54 different negotiating tables, which makes it easier for Facebook to have their way here. And so time will tell what happens just for consumers there.
Mark, thanks very much for joining us in studio today, all the way from Kenya. Jarred, thanks to you as well for joining us in studio. And
we'll be back next month with another exciting topic that's driving the media and marketing industry.
Thank you for joining us on Marketing, Media and Money.